Hi, my name's Lucinda Curran. I'm a Chinese medicine practitioner and building biologist, and I'm also an author. And today I have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to Nicole Bijlsma, who is the founder of the Australian College of Environmental Studies, and she's a building biologist, a real pioneer in the field of health and the way our buildings impact on our well-being. And she's a mentor and great inspiration to me. So hello and welcome, Nicole.
Thanks for having me here, Lucinda. I'm looking forward to talking about building biology and why it's so relevant in the current era in light of the pandemic of issues that we're facing in society, like, neurobehavioral disorders like autism, dyslexia, etc., which are now considered a worldwide epidemic, to things like why fertility is becoming such an issue for naturopathic practitioners and TCM practitioners like yourself, and what that means for as building biologists, and why we're in the front seat to be able to help these natural therapists, integrative GPs, and more importantly the public who are suffering from a lot of conditions that are directly related to the health hazards in the built environment.
Absolutely. Now, I just wondered if we could maybe start, for people who aren't so familiar with what building biology is, with actually saying, what is a building biologist?
So a building biologist is someone who looks and examines for the health hazards in the built environment. That can be anything from electromagnetic field issues arising from wireless technology, to AC magnetic fields from appliances and building wiring, to things like mold and allergens like pollens, dander, dust mite, and other things like chemicals or VOCs that can come from household products, air fresheners, building materials. So we really look at how the built environment affects people both positively and negatively, and its impact on the mind, body and soul. We're now realising that the built environment has a huge role to play in many of the chronic illnesses that are now seen by natural therapists and integrative GPs. I've mentioned a few at the beginning, but it's becoming a pandemic, especially in the field of fertility and especially in the field of children's disorders like autism, dyslexia and ADHD.
It's quite amazing that there really is such a growing need for people like us doing the work that we're doing. And I guess one of the things that I find is in my clinic, in terms of the Chinese medicine, that I often see people who've been all over the place having all sorts of testing and come up with nothing that explains what's going on for them.
Yeah, look, really the way in which practitioners are trained, it's really a disease management approach. I mean, you look at GPs, the average consultation is 6 or 7 minutes. You're just managing symptoms. And unfortunately, the way in which a lot of natural therapists are trained is to treat symptoms and provide a bag full of stuff that patients may or may not need, which more importantly doesn't always address the cause of the patient's condition. So the thing that really shocked me, being a naturopath and acupuncturist for so long, 15 years, is when I started to walk into my patients' homes, I started to notice a really strong correlation between many of their illnesses, particularly insomnia and sleep disturbances and chronic fatigue syndrome and asthma, with what was going on in their home. And I think that's a really important part of clinical practice that has been missed, because most practitioners don't walk into their patients' homes and they don't see a connection that is so obvious when you're in their house. For example, like a cat that's sleeping in the cot of a baby who's allergic to cats, but their parents think, oh, but they love the cat. I mean, wow. Or mattresses that are 30 years old that are riddled with mold, and they don't connect the fact that that child's asthma is always worse in the early hours of the morning because, after taking a sample of that mattress, you realise it's contaminated with bacteria and fungi. Or you see the visible mold and you do the air testing and you go, wow, no one should be living in this building at the moment. So, it really helps you to see the cause, which is such an important part of preventative medicine. And I'm really hoping that integrative medicine and general medicine will move towards a preventative approach rather than managing diseases and symptoms.
And in terms of building biology and the industry itself, now it's been around since the 1970s, and it's probably much better known in Europe than it is here in Australia. So why is that so, and what do people generally associate with the things that we do? Like, what would be the other terminology that people might be more familiar with than the term building biology?
Well, I see building biologists like a naturopath for the environment in many ways, because you're going in there and you're examining what health hazards are there and connecting it with the patient's symptoms, you're not diagnosing diseases, but you're certainly saying, well, these are the type of symptoms that mold or pollens or allergens or EMFs or chemicals can cause. And isn't that interesting? They're similar to yours. And the fact that you get better when you're away from the home. So we make connections, and more importantly, we have a huge network of practitioners, from mold remediators and ICRC accredited cleaners to integrated physicians to really good tradespeople like electricians who know how to wire the building in a way that reduces people's exposures to the electric and magnetic fields, and to other practitioners like that. Now, building biology began in the 70s as a result of the oil embargo, which led to the process of sick building syndrome, because buildings got a lot tighter in order to make them more energy efficient. Unfortunately, that's happening with our homes now, and the consequences of that are often more water-related damaged buildings, and particularly because it doesn't account for the condensation created from bathrooms and laundry activities, or having a lot of people in a small space. The fact that we exhale water vapour can create condensate, etc. So there's issues with the way in which we're building homes now that are significantly contributing to the incidences of allergies and asthma, etc., amongst other issues. Why hasn't it become so? Why has it only recently become an issue here in Australia? Well, I brought building biology into Australia in the early 2000s, and in 2005 it was the first government accredited training course in Australia. It took 7 years to write the course. And it was very different to when I went to the States to do it initially, because our building materials here are very different. Our drinking water distribution system, the regulation of chemicals is very different. So our needs here are quite different compared to many other countries in the world. And now the literature's exploded on environmental health. I mean, the literature now you find on the search engine databases significantly more in the last 5 to 10 years than they ever have been, especially in their relationship to understanding the impact of electromagnetic fields on the human body, increasing blood-brain permeability, its impact on the cell. Professor Martin Powell goes into detail on its impact on the cell. We're starting to now realise that potentially chronic fatigue syndrome, electromagnetic hypersensitivity, biotoxin and mold-related illnesses, and chemical sensitivity are probably the same illness, a low-grade systemic inflammation, and that's starting to come into the scientific literature as well. So we're starting to see and have a better understanding of how the environment causes the genes to express themselves. And that's probably the big reason also why environment is becoming such a big player now, is because since the development of the Human Genome Project in the early 2000s, instead of genes being the cause of many illnesses, we now realise the environment is the most important trigger to determining whether these genes are turned on or are switched on or off. We now know that what people eat matters. We know what they drink matters. We know what they inhale in terms of contaminants matters. We know that their exposure to stress or toxic stress, to things like electromagnetic fields and chemicals, actually having epigenetic effects in the womb, which can have effects not only on their children but their grandchildren. So this whole area of epigenetics and nutrigenomics and toxigenomics and all the omics sciences that are coming out in the scientific literature are saying that the environment is actually triggering the expression of these genes. So finally we're starting to get some traction that what naturopaths have learned for a long time about diet and lifestyle are very important triggering factors to the development or not of disease.
Absolutely. And I find too, I think being a Chinese medicine practitioner and the way we look holistically, it's similar to naturopathy, but we're looking at it in a different way. It's almost a very Chinese medicine approach, and looking really at the root, the cause of the problem, rather than just the manifestations. But one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit with you about was even the fact people are looking at using all sorts of building materials nowadays that weren't used previously. So for instance, they might be doing an extension that is affordable, but they're using, say, a ColourBond sheeting with polystyrene insulation because it's energy efficient, it's well insulated, all of that kind of thing. But there's a huge amount of problems with that in terms of people's health.
Absolutely. I think people go, you know, fungi was always around for a long period of time in terms of the whole mold epidemic. Now it's becoming more of an issue simply because the building materials have changed significantly. We have now what I would call fast food for mold. We have particle board that's like pre-digested. We have a plywood. We have materials that are not in their natural state. And this is very different to natural materials like hardwood timbers that have resins that are naturally fungicidal. And therefore, when you have, because fungi is everywhere from the Arctic to the Antarctic, as soon as you, and the building materials are the perfect materials for it to grow, as soon as you have moisture sitting there for more than 48 hours, you have the perfect environment for fungi and bacteria to have a field day in a party. And this is now what we're realising is a big contributing factor to many of the chronic fatigue symptoms we see. But yes, in terms of changes in building regulation, we have furnishings we have chemicals that are not regulated. You know, our authorities will regulate individual industrial chemicals coming into Australia and the US, but they don't regulate imported goods, which is just nuts. So what you have is blankets and furnishings and mattress that could be potentially loaded with high levels of formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen and a very strong skin and lung irritant. That is not regulated, but Australian manufacturers for mattresses would never be able to put this in their mattress. When was the last time you bought an Australian-made product? Clothes, furnishings, bedding. Very few Australians do. I mean, 90% of our furnishings and our textiles and our clothing and our footwear actually are imported from Asia. So when you bring those things into the built environment and then you create energy efficient homes that are so tight that there's virtually very little passive ventilation, it's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. Now, the other thing that's, I think, quite clear is that it's the industry itself is really evolving and growing. So what are some of the changes that are happening with the course because of that?
Well, because the amount of information in the scientific literature is increasing incredibly, I really think the knowledge and skills that a building biologist needs would include things like a very good understanding of the impact of electromagnetic fields, the sources, firstly, of EMFs in wireless technology and in the built environment from wiring and appliances. A lot of the time they may not be an issue, but other times they will. So you need to know the frequencies involved, where the sources are, the basics of radiation, you know, that it drops off with distance. You need to be able to have a good understanding of the terminology used by electricians, because we work a lot with electricians to explain how we want things, why, to reduce the client's exposure to potential electric fields, AC magnetic fields, and of course radio frequencies. You need to have a good understanding with plumbers, you know, why they need to have poly pipe, for example, near the water meter to stop that current on the old metal water pipes. So you're liaising with a huge network of people. More recently, I've done quite a lot of lecturing at medical conferences, educating integrated GPs about how to diagnose environmental health-related illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome, which I think is a misdiagnosis, electromagnetic hypersensitivity and chemical sensitivity. More importantly, how the built environment can contribute to that. So a really good knowledge of the sources of hazards in the home. Electromagnetic fields, mold, and the different ways in which we test for those, chemicals, the sources of those, particularly in household products, how to read a label, you know, what's not on the label, how are things regulated. These are things that a building biologist needs to know, and more importantly, know how to research this and find that data from authoritative websites throughout the world and from the scientific literature. They also need to be able to use complex technical equipment, you know, air sampling equipment, indoor air quality meters, moisture meters, thermal cameras, boroscopes, even things like, you know, binoculars are fantastic to use on site to be able to check things from a distance on the roof, flashing, all of those sort of things that are an important part of diagnosing potential problems, especially in water damaged buildings. An understanding of, you know, how the mobile phone tower system works, the radiation used in mobile phone technology, how it's tested, why SARS are tested, not, you know, through conventional meters, the different types of electromagnetic field equipment. It's complicated. You know, testing for AC magnetic fields is very different to testing for radio frequencies from wireless technology, which requires a good understanding of built environment and building materials. You know, the sarking, for example, in the roof and the vapor barriers in the in the walls can have significant impacts on reflecting radio frequencies in the built environment. So knowing how to use your meter, what type of meters to buy, and where to point the antenna is critical for RF measurements. So really, you need to know the sources of the different health hazards in the built environment. Allergens, of course, mold, dander, house dust, mite, etc., pollens. You need to know what instruments to use. You need to be able to compare that to the Australian exposure standards and international standards and the building biology standards. And then you need to come up with, and also analyse laboratory results. You know, when we're sending samples to the lab to be cultured for bacteria or fungi, you need to understand what that means when it comes back. You need to be able to do your conversions of the chemicals that you picked on that PID, photoionisation detector for chemicals. What does that mean when it comes back, and convert it through scientific calculations into being able to compare it to the Australian exposure standards and other exposure standards, and know what is appropriate for the client to be exposed to. And lastly, of course, with all of that, you need to be able to get that information and then come up with a plan to determine how much of this could be contributing to the client's illnesses by working with their practitioners, and more importantly, what can we do to reduce their exposure to these contaminants. I'm very against electromagnetic field shielding fabrics and things, insofar as people, you know, often are doing a huge amount of, these companies are doing shielding. They have virtually no training in EMF testing, and they're recommending people spend tens of thousands of dollars shielding, when in fact that's not really required because it is a conflict of interest. Shielding definitely has a place and it's very useful. However, I think it's really important that people get a building biologist in as an independent consultant to check pre and post to determine what is appropriate, because that can save the client and consumer a lot of money. They need to be experts in understanding what devices do work at reducing electromagnetic fields or allergens and chemicals. So they need a really good understanding of a diverse range of fields in order to be able to determine if the built environment is affecting consumers, and more importantly, what they need to do to address that. And lastly, of course, liaising and networking with a huge array of tradespeople, integrative physicians and natural therapists, mould remediators, cleaners, in being able to bring in the right expert to be able to address or remediate what needs to be done in that particular client's home. So the homes they go to are very diverse. What you're going to find is very different. You need good critical evaluation techniques. You need the ability to have the right equipment. You need to know how to use the equipment. You need to know the limitations of that equipment. And then you need to be able to indicate and know a good understanding of the adverse health effects associated with the various hazards, to see if actually the house is contributing to the client's home. So there's a lot of amazing skills and knowledge that you need as a building biologist, and this is why we're developing it as an advanced diploma in building biology, which is just one under a degree in this particular field. So we're really exciting about the new course that is coming up at the Australian College of Environmental Studies and the ramifications of that, and the fact that much of the work we're doing is actually getting a lot of referrals from integrative GPs nowadays and from natural therapists, which is really exciting.
It's such an amazing course, I have to say, having been through it myself. It's just totally incredible. And I think one of the things that you missed in that massive long list of things that we do is to be able to work out solutions and then communicate that to the client as well. So that's often in a written format. So I guess the news for people who are watching this is we don't just go in there and say, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, but we go, okay, and here's a list of ideas and solutions that we would recommend. And I just wanted to pick up on the point about the shielding. We do, I'm the president of the association, the Australasian Society of Building Biologists, and we do have a number of our building biologist members who do sell shielding. And I think this is just one thing to be aware of. We actually have had thorough training in this, and we are very, very careful in how we recommend it and how we use it. And also many of us will only sell it to people who've had a building biology consultation. So it's so easy to get shielding wrong. And as Nicole said, people have spent tens of thousands of dollars on getting shielding done that has actually made them worse, not better, because the person who has done the shielding hasn't understood that. So do look out for the ASBB logo, the Australasian Society of Building Biologists, to check that the building biologist you're working with is qualified and accredited by us, and then also that if they are recommending shielding, they have that training. So there's just something to look out for there.
Definitely. So yeah, lastly, I think what's really important about being a government accredited course, a big part of becoming accredited through the government was to be able to show that the students that came out of the college were competent. And that required us to actually be very clear about the knowledge and skills that a building biologist needs in order to achieve that. Big part of the assessments are based on developing questionnaires, checklists and reports, so that by the time you finish the course, you had the templates ready to go and work in the industry. So I think the fact that we're government accredited is probably one of the first, certainly in the Southern Hemisphere, for building biology, and it really goes to show how strong the industry is and the fact that more and more people are becoming aware of it.
And with the accreditation process, you don't just apply for accreditation and that's it. Could you talk us a little bit more about what happens once you are accredited, please?
Oh my God, I seem to spend most of my time stuck in administration. It's like ISO 9000 and worse in many ways. Because it requires an incredible amount of policies and procedures, getting audited regularly by the government to show the proof of what the quality of work that our students come up with, why their assessments are checklist, questionnaire and reports, our consultation with industry on a regular basis like the ASBB, getting external consultants to come in and say, how can we do this better? Is the delivery and the training materials adequate for the students to get the knowledge? Is the practical training that we provide on campus sufficient for them to be able to get the skills? Where is the evidence that they have these knowledge and skills? You know, so we keep all their assignments, we assess them, and we give lots of feedback. So half the time, 50% of the time, all my lecturers will provide feedback to students' assessments to add more things or to look at something slightly different before we assess it as satisfactory or competent. So, you know, there's a hell of a lot of work that my trainers put into providing feedback for students and being there to make sure that, you know, the consultants that come out of here are the best that they can be and are making a difference to hundreds, potentially thousands of people in the country.
It's a massive process, that's for sure. And so you mentioned earlier that you're developing or just about to launch the advanced diploma of building biology. Could you tell us what some of the changes are in the new course as opposed to the old course?
Yeah, so in the new course, there's more of a focus on children's environmental health, and that's really to come into line the huge change in our understanding of epigenetic effects in the womb, and in particularly how electromagnetic fields and chemicals can trigger the genes to express themselves that can cause certain types of diseases later on in adulthood: diabetes, obesity, fertility, breast cancer, testicular cancer, cardiovascular disease, etc. So the whole issue of endocrine disrupting chemicals or hormone disrupting chemicals, BPA is just one of almost 1,000 hormone disrupting chemicals now on the market. So the building biologist needs to be very au fait with where these chemicals are, because they're mainly in the home. They're in our household products, they're in building materials. And it's very simple to reduce your exposure to them once you know where they are and provide alternative solutions. So that's a big change to the course, particularly in relation to mould, because of the explosion of our understanding of how to test for mould and, more importantly, how to identify it as a potential effect on the human body. We have a better idea of the pathology that underpins mould exposure. We used to think it was mainly causing lung-related problems. Now we realise it's not just lung, it's systemic problems that are very similar to what we see with chronic fatigue syndrome in certain genotypes, and 24% of the population who could be susceptible to this. So, you know, there's been an explosion of this in the scientific literature. So I'm really excited to show my students why even more they need to have really good understanding of the knowledge and skills, particularly in biotoxins, and how electromagnetic fields can impact that and make it worse because of its ability to increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier to these biotoxins and the chemicals. And that, in fact, you know, I really don't see that these chronic fatigue symptoms are separate to EHS, to MCS, to, you know, chemical exposure and mold-related illnesses. So really the building biologist needs to know when they're going in there that they don't just test for mold, they don't just test for EMFs, they need to do all of it. So I've moved away a lot from just doing, I'm going to just do an electromagnetic field test for your home, or I'm just going to check for allergens, because I know in those symptoms that all of those factors could play a role in that particular person. So I think it's really important that a building biologist has to have the knowledge, not just in EMFs. They have to know about biotoxins because the symptoms are almost identical. You know, often people have a bee in their bottle about something in the house, could be a smart meter, which may or may not be an issue. But in fact, it's the mold growing in their bedroom that's a huge issue that can cause similar symptoms to radio frequencies. So the building biologist needs to be well versed in this. They need to be able to talk the language to discuss this with their client's GP. And more importantly, this gives them the power and the tools and the informed knowledge to be able to make a difference on such a massive scale with their clients.
It's just incredible. I put all those health conditions, because I see them as very similar as well, I put them all in the umbrella of environmental sensitivity. So that includes multiple chemical sensitivities or chemical sensitivities, EHS or electromagnetic hypersensitivity, chronic fatigue, Lyme disease, biotoxin-related illnesses, food intolerances, food sensitivities, the whole gamut. There's so much to it, and there's definitely a very big overlap with that. And I think that is one of the major things that we're sort of looking at too with the ASBB is helping practitioners realise they need to do the full gamut of everything to look at what's happening in a home for people. And I guess too for people, members of the public, to realise that even if there was water damage a while ago, it can still be active. So an example is I went to a home recently where they had a leak from a gutter that had overflowed, and just above the window there was a patch that had been damaged. And it was, you know, well over a year ago. It'd been fixed about that time. And I took a mould sample from there, and it was almost at the extreme level. It was very, very high. So just for people to be aware that there's a lot more going on than what you think. And I think in my practice particularly, I do see so many people that say it's the smart meter, or it was this, or it was that. But that tends to be the last straw, the straw that broke the camel's back before, you know, they tipped over into the state of ill health, whereas really it is these other things that are a bit more ubiquitous, maybe not quite so obvious, that they're actually exposed to all the time without realising.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Many of the worst hazards that I've seen in a client's home, I couldn't see it, I couldn't smell it, I couldn't feel it. So the more experience I get in this industry, the less advice I give over a phone, because until you're there on site, you don't know what's going on. And certainly with mold, the worst times I've ever been in, there was no sign of visible mold. You couldn't see it, you couldn't smell it, didn't smell damp. And the samples came back, and wow, those clients literally walked out with clothes on their back, not to return for 12 months until the whole house was remediated. So I think that's an important point, which justifies why building biology is such a rapidly growing industry. Thank you.
It's wonderful. And so is there anything else that you'd like to share about the new course or about building biology in general?
No, only that I feel, you know, after having done a double degree and not learning about environmental health, this area is just an emerging field in natural therapies that urgently needs more GPs and natural therapists to have a good understanding of environmental health and its impact on people's diseases. Because I think, you know, the frustrating thing for me was not getting to the cause of a lot of my patients' conditions when I was in clinical practice. And now I feel like I really get to the root cause a lot of the time, and it's very empowering to work in that industry, and very humble to be working with clients and seeing huge changes from, you know, little changes around the house that can make massive consequences to the health of those occupants and particularly to the kids.
It's lovely. And I think one of the other things I really, really appreciate with this too is that it's not so much just working in isolation as a building biologist. As you said, we're networking with so many different people. So it's like we've got a team that we bring in to help the client to get to the cause and to deal with it effectively, to get their health back and their lives back on track.
Exactly right.
Well, thank you, Nicole, so much for coming and sharing so much about building biology and about especially the new course, which is so exciting. So thank you for your time.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Lucinda.